When Imogen Vale began tearing up the floor of her own cabin and dragging river stones through the front door by the armload, her neighbors in Blackwood said the grief had finally taken her. They said it quietly, the way people in small settlements speak about things they cannot explain behind cupped hands at the general store, in the pauses between sentences at the Sunday gathering. She was 36 years old, 4 months a widow, alone with 2 children, and a debt she could not yet name the full size of, and she was building something in the middle of her living floor that no one in the Dakota Territory had ever seen. People shook their heads. Alaric Graves, who had built more chimneys than any man alive in Blackwood, stopped his wagon at the edge of her property and watched for a full 3 minutes before calling out across the frozen yard. His voice carried the kind of authority that comes from decades of being right. "Smoke rises, Mrs. Vale. That's the only law you can't break out here." But what they didn't know, what none of them could have seen from the road, from their wagons, from the safe distance of their assumptions, was that Imogen Vale was not building in ignorance. She was building from memory, from the hands of a woman who had crossed an ocean and carried the old knowledge folded inside her like a second heartbeat. Before we continue, if you're someone who believes that the quiet people, the ones who simply keep working while others laugh, carry something worth listening to, then please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Stories like this one are what we're here for. Now, let us go back to the beginning. The summer of 1883 had taken Caleb Vale in the space of 11 days. Typhoid moved through settlements the way fire moved through dry grass, fast and without preference. Caleb was 39, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who fixed things before they broke and never mentioned doing it. He had come from Ohio the year before with a wagon, a deed, a young wife, and a belief in the particular mercy of new ground. The Dakota Territory had not been kind to that belief. The first winter nearly finished all of them. The second summer took him. Imogen had nursed him through the fever with creek water and willow bark tea, and the steady, terrible calm of someone who refuses to let fear show on her face while her children are watching. Della had been 10, then old enough to understand what the stillness in her father's chest meant when it finally came. Wendell had been 5, and he had simply stopped asking when Papa was coming to supper after the third day, which was somehow worse than crying. By September, the debt was real and had a number. $41 to Thomas Grant's general store. 2 cords of hardwood that hadn't been split yet. A lame ox. The cabin itself was sound enough, sod walls, packed tight timber framing Caleb had done himself, but the hearth was the problem it had always been. An open stone fireplace along the north wall, vertical flue, the same design every family in the settlement used. The previous winter, with Caleb alive and feeding it through the night, they had still woken to water frozen in the pitcher and their breath hanging visible in the air above their beds. One winter alone with half the firewood and no one to keep the night watch, Imogen did not let herself finish that calculation. She simply pulled open the cedar trunk at the foot of the bed and began to look. Her mother had come from Bohemia in 1849. Marta Voss had not come empty-handed. She had brought a small leather satchel, a tin of cooking tools, a Bible with a cracked spine, and a set of folded papers, hand-drawn in the particular dense ink her mother favored, technical drawings in the old style, with measurements notated in a mix of Czech and rough English, the margins crowded with notes. These were the plans for a kachelofen, a masonry heater, the kind that Marta's own father had built in their house in the Erzgebirge region, and his father before him, and on back through generations of people who understood something that most American settlers had never needed to know, that a fire's job is not to burn. Its job is to store. Imogen had grown up watching her mother tend a kachelofen in their Ohio kitchen. She remembered the way the morning fire blazed white-hot and fast, almost violent in its intensity, and then went quiet. She remembered pressing her palm flat against the smooth clay face of the bench hours after the flames had died, feeling the heat still breathing there like something alive. She had been 7 years old, and she had thought it was magic. She was 36 now, and she understood it was physics. But understanding and building are 2 different countries. She spread the papers on the table and held the lantern low over them. The drawings were meticulous, her mother's hand precise and unhurried, the kind of penmanship that takes years of practice. Isometric cross-sections of the firebox, arrows showing airflow direction downward and lateral rather than straight up. A serpentine channel running horizontal for 12 feet through what appeared to be a stone platform, the entire structure raised above the cabin floor by 6 inches of dense clay. At the bottom of the last page in her mother's careful handwriting, a single line in Czech. Drž teplo. Hold the warmth. Imogen sat with that phrase for a long time. Then she looked at the north wall of her cabin, and at the existing chimney stack, and at her sleeping children, and at the frost already forming at the edges of the window glass in the last week of September. She picked up the lantern and walked out to the yard in the dark to look at what river stones she had. The work began the following morning before the children woke. She did not announce it. She did not ask permission. She went out to the creek bank with the ox-drawn sled and began selecting stones, dense, smooth-faced stones, the kind that hold heat without cracking, the kind her mother's note specified with a little sketch in the margin and the word teshki heavy. The ox was lame in the left foreleg, but manageable for short pulls. Imogen worked for 3 hours before Della appeared at the door wrapped in her father's old coat, her dark hair still sleep-tangled, watching her mother haul stone. "What are you building?" "Something that should have been built last year." Della came down off the step and helped without being asked. She was 11 now, and she had inherited Caleb's quality of observing a problem before commenting on it. She loaded stones while Imogen pulled, and they went back and forth to the creek until the yard had a good pile, and then Imogen went inside and began tearing out the hearthstone. The noise of it brought Wendell to the doorway. He stood in his nightshirt, watching his mother pry up the base of the fireplace with an iron bar, his face a question he was too young to phrase. Imogen set down the bar and went to him. "Mama's going to fix the cold," she told him. "Go find your stockings." He disappeared. Children at 6 still believe that things can simply be fixed. The process of destruction took 2 days. Imogen pulled the hearthstones, the lower course of the chimney stack, the clay base, all of it. She left the upper flue intact and capped it with a board, for now she would tie into it eventually, but at a very different angle than it had been designed for. The floor of the cabin was a rough rectangle of raw earth, again 12 feet across, and she stood at its center and held her mother's drawings and looked at the space the way a builder looks at empty ground. Not seeing what is there, seeing what will be. She drove stakes into the earth to mark the path of the channel. The serpentine route snaking back and forth across the center of the floor was not decorative. It was deliberate. The longer the hot exhaust gas had to travel through stone before it reached the sky, the more heat it would surrender to the stone instead. That was the entire logic of the thing, refused to let the heat escape until it had paid its full price. On the third morning, the first neighbor came to see. Alaric Graves arrived without his wagon this time, which meant the visit was personal rather than incidental. He was a large man, broad through the chest, with the particular posture of someone who has been the most competent person in the room for so long that his spine had memorized it. He stood at the edge of the torn-up floor and looked at the stake-marked trench and the pile of river stone and the disassembled chimney base, and his expression moved through several things before settling on concern. "Mrs. Vale." He removed his hat, which was a courtesy he hadn't offered from the wagon. "This is your home. I'm aware. You have 2 children in it. Also aware." He looked at the stakes. He looked at the drawings in her hand. His jaw moved as though he were chewing something. "You cannot run a horizontal flue. The draft will stall inside the channel. The smoke will back up into the room. Carbon gas will—" He stopped. He started again. "You'll choke them. Quietly. In the night before you smell it." It was not a cruel thing to say. That was what made it hard to answer. It was the assessment of a man who genuinely knew his trade, and genuinely believed what he was saying, and genuinely could not imagine that he had never encountered the one design that turned every assumption of his craft sideways. "The firebox runs at over 1,500 degrees, Imogen said. "That temperature creates its own draft. The heat pulls the exhaust down and along the channel. By the time the gas reaches the outlet flue, it's been stripped of almost all its heat." She paused. "And all its danger." Alaric Graves looked at her for a long time. Then he put his hat back on and walked back to his wagon without speaking. Hattie Greaves came the following afternoon, which was a different kind of visit entirely. Hattie was the settlement's midwife, and its closest equivalent to a doctor, a small, fierce woman in her 60s who moved through other people's trouble with the brisk competence of someone who has seen too much of it to be frightened by any particular instance. She arrived with a pair of heavy leather gloves and no explanation for why she was wearing them, and she went straight to the stone pile and began sorting. These ones, she said, holding up a dark river stone. Dense. Good grain. These will hold. You know about this? Imogen watched her. My husband does. Otho. He was a kiln builder before his hands gave out. She set the stone in the keeper pile and picked up another. He doesn't get out much anymore, but he still talks about heat the way other men talk about horses. On and on. Imogen took the next stone Hattie held out. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the particular silence of two women doing a necessary thing which has a different quality from every other kind of silence. Hattie, Imogen said finally, "Why are you here?" "Because Thomas Grant told my neighbor that you'd lost your mind to grief. And the last 3 times Thomas Grant said a woman had lost her mind to grief, she turned out to be the most sensible person in Blackwood." Hattie did not look up from the stones. "Also, your children will freeze if you don't get this done before November." They kept working until the light went. October came in on a cold wind from the northwest that felt less like autumn and more like a warning. Imogen built the firebox first, a small, dense cube of the hardest brick she had sourced from a collapsed outbuilding 2 miles east, whose owner was glad to be rid of it. The brick had to be tight. The firebox was the heart of the system, and hearts have no tolerance for gaps. She packed the joints with a clay sand mortar. She mixed herself the ratio from her mother's notes, and she let each course cure before she set the next. The trench came next. She excavated the floor to a depth of 14 inches across the full serpentine path, lined the bottom with flat stone, and began to build the channel walls up from the earth. Della worked beside her each morning before school, Wendell beside them both on weekends, passing stones and holding the clay bucket and asking questions that Imogen answered as fully as she could, because she had decided early that her children were going to understand what they were building, not just carry stones for it. "Why does the smoke go sideways?" Wendell asked one afternoon. "Because we're making it work before it leaves," Imogen told him. "It can't go until it's paid its part." He thought about that in the way 6-year-olds think about things, completely silently with full seriousness. "Okay," he said, and handed her another stone. The process was not without failure. The first section of channel she built developed a crack in the third course. She had packed the mortar too wet and let a freeze get at it overnight. She tore out the section and rebuilt it. The second section held. The clay cap over the channel, when she finally sealed the first 6 feet and tested the draft by burning a handful of dry grass inside the box, produced a result that stopped her breath. The smoke went down and sideways. It did not billow back. It did not stall. It moved as the drawing said it would move, pulled along by the heat itself, a willing traveler. She pressed both hands over her mouth and stood there in the cold of the half-built cabin and felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight for 4 months. It was around this time that she found the board. She had been pulling up a section of the old flooring near the north wall planks she wanted to reuse for the capped surface of the stone bench when she noticed the marks on the underside of one. She carried it to the window for the light. Caleb's handwriting. She would have known it anywhere, the particular way he formed his C's and his V's, the way he bore down on the pencil when he was thinking carefully. A sketch. Rough, nothing like her mother's measured drawings, but unmistakably the same shape, a firebox, a horizontal run, a stone bench across the width of a cabin. Below it in Caleb's hand the words for when I figure the dimensions. Spring, maybe? Make it right. Imogen held the board for a long time. He had known. Somehow, without her mother's drawings, without anyone to tell him the name or the engineering he had been working toward, the same idea, moving toward it by instinct and love, and the particular stubbornness of a man who hated watching his family be cold. He had been building it in his mind all through that first terrible winter, and into the spring, and then the summer had taken him before the ground was soft enough to start. She turned the board over and set it face down on the pile. She could not look at it anymore just then. Outside, the wind picked up against the cabin walls. Della called something from across the yard. Wendell's voice answered, higher and cheerful, untroubled. The sound of them moving through the world without knowing what she had just held in her hands. Imogen pressed her palm flat against the half-built stone bench. The stone was cold. It would not be cold for long. Thomas Grant came on a Thursday, which was his collection day, and he stood inside the cabin door with his ledger book and looked at the structure rising from the center of the floor with the expression of a man encountering something he cannot classify and therefore cannot price. Mrs. Vale. He opened the book. Your account. I know what my account says, Mr. Grant. Then you know it comes due at end of month. She did know. $41, which she did not have. She set down the stone she had been mortaring and cleaned her hands on her apron. She looked at the ledger, then at Grant, then at the stone bench that ran 7 feet across the center of her home, still 2 courses short of its finished height. I need 2 additional sections of stovepipe, she said, 4 feet each, before I can complete the outlet flue. Grant looked at the structure. He had the expression of a man identifying risk. I'm not extending further credit for... He looked at the channel at the firebox at the downward-angled exhaust port. His voice slowed. What is this exactly? It's how we're getting through winter, Imogen said. Yours and mine both. She looked at him steadily. If I freeze out here before spring, Mr. Grant, your $41 freezes with me. If I get through winter, I'll be the only person in Blackwood who knows how to build one of these, and come spring, there will be families lining up wanting to know how it's done. Help me finish it, and I'll make sure they all come to your store for the materials. Grant closed the ledger. He did not say yes. He did not say no. He left without the pipe sections, and he left without pressing the debt further, and for Thomas Grant that was a variety of answer. The pipe came 3 days later, brought by his store boy without a word from Grant himself. It was a cold night in the second week of October when Imogen finally sealed the system. The last section of the outlet flue was mortared. The clean outdoors Caleb had salvaged from an old stove, small cast-iron squares she had found in the back of the barn, were set into the corners of the channel where soot would eventually need clearing. The channel surface, now fully enclosed under its stone cap, ran from the firebox all the way to the east wall and back twice before rising into the existing vertical flue she had reused at a lower angle than intended. She sent the children to Hattie's for the night. She didn't tell them why. She just said Hattie needed help with the new litter of barn cats, and Della looked at her with eyes that understood more than she said, and Wendell ran ahead without question. Imogen built the fire herself. She used willow branches, a bundle of dry prairie grass, and 4 pieces of split pine, small fuel meant for an intense, fast burn rather than a long smolder. She opened the draft as wide as the firebox allowed and touched the match to the grass. The fire took immediately. It was not a gentle fire. It was a violent one, the kind that breathes fast and climbs to temperature in minutes, the pale-burning, high-efficiency flame of wood combusting almost completely clean. The box filled with light. She could feel the heat pressing against the cast-iron door even before she stepped back. She watched the smoke. That was all she had to watch. For 30 seconds there was nothing. Then the draft caught. She could hear it, a low hiss, almost like a sustained exhale, and the smoke bent downward into the exhaust port and disappeared into the stone. She waited. She pressed the back of her hand against the channel cap at the far end of the bench, the end nearest the outlet, and counted breaths. 4 minutes into the burn, the stone was warm. 8 minutes in, she could feel it through her sleeve. She sat down on the floor of her cabin with her back against the half-warm stone and her knees pulled to her chest and listened to the fire working its way through 15 feet of rock. Outside the window, the temperature was dropping toward freezing. Inside, the air was still. No draft pulling at the cracks. No cold seeping in along the floor. Just the slow, patient, accumulating warmth of stone doing what stone does when you ask it the right way. She had not cried since Caleb. Not once. Not when she buried him. Not when she opened the ledger. Not when she told Wendell that Papa wasn't coming to supper anymore. She cried now. Not loudly. Not for long. Just the kind of crying that happens when you've been holding your breath for 4 months and you finally understand in your body rather than your head that you might actually make it. Then she noticed the smoke. It was not in the room that was the first thing she confirmed, scanning the air near the ceiling where it would pool if the system were failing. The air was clear, but there was something wrong with the outlet pressure, a faint irregularity in the hiss from the channel, and she went to the firebox and saw that the draft door was not sealing properly. The intense burn had expanded the metal slightly, a gap of 1/4 inch at the upper left corner. The smoke was not yet backing up, but it would. She had no sealant ready. She had not anticipated this. She looked around the cabin with the focused, desperate calm of someone solving a problem in real time, and her eyes landed on the cedar trunk by the bed. She had packed the top of the trunk with her mother's things, the drawings, the Bible, the small tin tools, and at the bottom, wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth, the one object she had carried across all of it. The thing her mother had pressed into her hands at the door of the Ohio house the morning she and Caleb left for the territory. A fired clay brick small enough to hold in 2 hands. Dense and dark red, the color of old blood or good earth made in her mother's own kiln from the particular clay of the Bohemian highlands her mother had carried in a sealed crock across the Atlantic, purely because she could not bear to make the first brick of a new life from unknown ground. On its face, pressed into the clay before firing 2 words in her mother's hand: Dirge Teplo. Imogen held the brick and looked at the firebox and at the imperfect seal and at the bench glowing with its first real warmth, and she made a decision. She could not use the brick to seal the gap. The clay was already fired, already set, not suitable for fresh packing. But she could do something else. She went to the mortar she had left in the bucket, still workable from that afternoon, and she packed the gap by hand, pressing with her fingers until the seal was tight. Then she took the brick, her mother's brick, and she set it on the top of the bench, at the center, where it would be the last thing sealed in when she finished the surface cap tomorrow. It fit the space as though it had been made for it, which in a way it had. She kept the fire going another hour, and then let it die, and she lay down on the stone bench in her coat and her work dress, and put her cheek against the clay surface above where the channel ran, and felt the stored heat pressing back against her face, steady and certain. And she was asleep before she had finished the thought she had started. She woke to Della standing over her, still in Hattie's scarf, her breath making small clouds in the morning air. The bench was warm, still warm. The fire had been out for hours, and the stone was still warm. Della put her hand flat against it, her 11-year-old hand smaller than Imogen's, the palm still soft from the years before hard work had found it, and her face did something complicated. She looked at her mother on the bench, and at the firebox, and at the darkened stones of the channel, and back at her mother. "Bongwai's drawing," she said. "It worked." "It did," Imogen said. Della kept her hand on the stone for a long time. The morning light came flat and cold through the east window, falling across the brick on the center of the bench. Dirge Teplo pressed into red clay, the letters filling with shadow. Outside, the temperature was 17 degrees and falling. November was 6 days away. That same morning, while Imogen was mixing mortar to finish the surface cap, Hattie Greaves appeared at the door with a covered pot of corn porridge and a look on her face that was different from her usual expression, careful, almost tentative. The look of someone carrying a thing they are not sure how to hand over. She set the pot on the edge of the bench, and she watched the warmth fog the underside of the lid, and she said, "My husband Otho, he said I should tell you something when the bench was working. When I was sure it was working." Imogen waited. Otho built his first cachalofen at 16. He was apprenticed to a kiln master near Bratislava. His master's name was Voss. Hattie looked at her. He said the drawings he used, then they were a woman's drawings. The master showed them to all his apprentices and said they came from his sister, who had emigrated to America years before. He said she was better at the theory than any man he had trained. Imogen stopped mixing. "Voss," she said. "That was my mother's name, before she married." Hattie nodded slowly. "The drawings Otho learned from. The bench your mother taught him to build. He's been thinking about it since you started this, since I told him what you were doing. He thinks you have the same papers." Imogen looked at the open cedar trunk, at the folded drawings inside it. "The world is small," Hattie said softly, "and the things people know travel farther than the people do." Imogen sat down on the bench on the still warm stone beside her mother's brick. She put both hands flat on the surface. Outside, the wind came down from the north the way it had for 1,000 Dakota winters before this one, indifferent and cold and patient. Inside the cabin where the stone held what the fire had left behind, the warmth did not waver. November was coming, and then January, and then the thing that none of them yet knew to call by name, only to feel approaching in the particular quality of the cold that was building out on the plains, moving east, slow and certain and enormous. But the stone was warm, and Imogen Vale sat with her hands pressed against it and let herself believe for the first time in 4 months that warm could last. Otho Greaves came on a Tuesday, which was the only day his knees allowed him the wagon ride. He was 71 years old and moved like a man who had spent 5 decades in argument with gravity and was beginning to lose. He arrived without announcement, which seemed to be a habit of his wife's that he had absorbed over the years, and he stood at the cabin door with a walking stick and a rolled paper under one arm, and looked at the finished bench the way a man looks at a thing he built himself 40 years ago in a country that no longer exists. He did not compliment it. He walked to it and put his hand on it flat, the whole palm, the way someone checks the temperature of a child's forehead, and stood there with his eyes half closed. "Good stone," he said finally. "Heavy grain." From the East Creek bed, Imogen told him. "I walked it for 3 days choosing." He nodded. He unrolled his paper on the bench surface. His own drawings faded to the color of old straw. The ink lines still clean, and set 2 small stones at the corners to hold it flat. He did not reach for tools. He did not move toward the firebox. He simply pointed at a junction in his sketch, and then pointed at the corresponding place in her bench, a slight angle change at the second corner where the channel turned back. "Your bend here is 2 degrees steeper than you want," he said. "Won't cause you trouble in October. By January, the gas velocity will drop at that corner, and you'll get a thin layer of soot building on the lower channel wall. It won't block, but it'll reduce your heat transfer by maybe 8%. Can I correct it?" He picked up a small piece of chalk from his coat pocket and made a mark on the bench capstone. "If you lift this course and repack the clay beneath before the first hard freeze sets the mortar—" "Yes." He put the chalk away. "After that, you live with 8%. Imogen looked at the chalk mark. She looked at the bench she had spent 6 weeks building. She lifted the course the following morning. Della held the stones as they came off, stacking them carefully in the order Imogen set them down so they could go back in sequence. Wendell fell asleep in the corner with his cheek against the warm lower stones and had to be carried to bed at noon. Imogen repacked the clay beneath the corner, adjusted the angle by eye and by feel, and rebuilt the section by late afternoon. Her hands were raw from the cold and the mortar both. Otho came back 4 days later to check the correction. He put his hand on the corner capstone. He said, "Yes, that's right." Then he went home. He came 3 more times in November. Each visit lasted less than an hour. He never stayed for a meal, never accepted more than a cup of water, never touched the bench except to test it. What he gave Imogen in those visits was not labor, it was precision. The difference between a thing that works and a thing that works correctly. She understood the distinction. Her mother had taught her that there is a version of every craft that holds together and a version that holds together well, and only one of them is worth leaving to your children. By the 3rd week of November, the surface cap was complete. The mortar had cured, the draft door sealed properly with a thin bead of fire clay she had gotten from Otho's personal supply pressed into the gap and smoothed with her thumbnail. The bench ran 10 feet across the center of the cabin, solid and dense and radiating a warmth that was different in character from the old open fireplace, less dramatic, more constant, like the difference between a shout and a long-held note. Imogen ran the system every 3rd morning. A small, fierce burn, twisted grass, dry willow, a few pieces of split pine lasting 40 minutes at most, the firebox running so hot that the metal door handle was untouchable with bare skin. Then the draft door closed, and the fire starved and went out, and the stone took over. The cabin held at 68 degrees through the night. She confirmed it with Caleb's mercury thermometer hung from the same nail near the bedroom door where he had always kept it. 68 in the bedroom. 72 in the main room over the bench. Outside on those November nights, the temperature dropped to 12 below and kept going. They were not cold. This was not a small thing. Imogen sat with it some evenings, the fact of it, her children sleeping without extra blankets. Wendell's face in the lamplight pink and easy. Della reading past 8 o'clock because her fingers were warm enough to hold the book comfortably. The previous winter she had rationed the firewood by the armload, and woken at 2 in the morning to feed the hearth, and still found ice in the wash basin by dawn. Now she was burning 1 small bundle every 3 days, and the cabin was warmer than it had ever been with Caleb alive, and feeding the old fireplace through the night. She thought about that last part more than she wanted to. News of the warm cabin traveled in the way that news travels in small settlements, indirectly, through the medium of other news. Someone mentioned it at Grant's store in the course of mentioning something else. Someone's wife asked Hattie a question that was really a different question. By late November, 3 women had found reasons to visit Imogen that had nothing to do with the bench, and everything to do with it. They came with a covered dish, with a question about a recipe, with a child who needed something the school hadn't covered. They sat on the bench for a few minutes each time, ostensibly just finding a place to set their things, and they went home and said nothing specific to anyone. But they came back. Mabel Foss, whose husband had 3 children by a first wife and 2 more by Mabel herself, and not enough firewood for any of them, came twice in 1 week. The second time she brought her oldest daughter, who was 13, and who sat on the bench and spread her hands flat on the stone surface and looked at Imogen with an expression that was half wonder and half longing, the look of a girl who has been cold for so long she had forgotten the word for the other thing. Imogen showed her the drawings. Not all of them, just the page with the channel cross-section, the simplest explanation. "Your firebox has to run hot enough to pull," she said. "That's the only part most people get wrong. They build small fires all day." She traced the airflow arrow with her finger. "You need 1 fast, clean fire. Let it run full, then close it down and let the stone take over." The girl studied the paper with the same quality of attention Della brought to things she intended to keep. Her mother said from the doorway, "Alaric Graves says the draft will stall." Alaric Graves, Imogen said, has not been in this cabin in November. Mabel looked at the bench, looked at her daughter's hands spread on the warm stone, looked at Imogen for a moment longer than the conversation required. Then she said, "I make a good apple butter, in case that ever matters to you." She left. A jar of apple butter appeared on Imogen's doorstep 2 days later with no note. Otho Greaves on his 4th, and what he said would be his last visit before the deep cold made the wagon ride impossible, brought a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a cast-iron thermometer bracket, old the kind machined before the war, with a small brass plate on the back engraved with initials that were not Otho's. "My master's," he said, "from Bratislava. He gave it to me when I emigrated. He wanted someone to keep measuring." He looked at the bench. He looked at the brick her mother had made set into the center of the captor's teplo, the letters now smooth with the cap mortar applied around them, the words still readable. "Voss," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "I thought of him as an old man. He would have been 42 when I apprenticed." He tapped the bracket against his palm. "His sister who went to America. He used to say she was better than him at theory. Said she understood fire the way other women understand thread, as something you work with, not against." He handed her the bracket. "Keep measuring," he said. "It matters that you know what you've built." He did not come again that winter. December brought a sustained cold front that pushed temperatures to 22 below for 11 straight days and tested the bench in a way that normal November cold could not. On the 3rd day of the front, Imogen did not light the morning fire, a deliberate experiment, not the recommended protocol, and by mid-afternoon the bench had dropped to a surface temperature of 81 degrees, still warm to the touch, still radiating into the room. The cabin dropped to 59 degrees by evening, which was low but livable, and she lit the fire then, and the stone climbed back within the hour. She recorded everything in Caleb's old account ledger, which she had repurposed for this fuel-used fire duration, indoor temperature at hour intervals, outdoor temperature from Otho's bracket mounted beside the door. Numbers were the language the bench spoke, and she was learning it. On the 8th day of the front, Alaric Graves came. He came without his wife, without his wagon, on foot through the snow from his property a quarter-mile east. He knocked, which he had not done either of the previous times, and he stood at the door when she opened it with an expression that had been worked over for a while before he arrived. He was wearing his heavy buffalo coat, and his breath was coming in short, visible bursts from the walk. "I came to see it working," he said. "Not to argue, just to see." Imogen stepped back from the door. He came inside and he stood, and he looked at the bench, not at the firebox, not at the outlet flue, but at the bench itself, the warm stone running across the center of the room, and at Della sitting cross-legged at one end of it with her school book, and at Wendell asleep against the wall at the other end, his small face slack with warmth. Alaric looked at Wendell for a moment too long. Imogen said, "Put your hand on the stone." He took off his right glove and pressed his palm flat against the capstone near the center, near her mother's brick. He held it there. His jaw tightened, not with pain, but with something that didn't have a simpler name. He pressed harder, as if he wanted to be certain. "The fire went out 2 hours ago," Imogen said. He looked at the firebox. Cold and dark, the draft door sealed. He did not say anything for almost a full minute. Outside, the wind moved against the north wall with a low, continuous sound. Then he said, "The gap at the corner. Your second turn. Did you correct it before it cured?" She said, "Yes." He nodded. He put his glove back on. "You're clean outdoors," he said. Cast iron, she showed him. He examined the fit of each one, pressing the flanges with his thumb. He said, "These are good. These will hold 30 winters." He stood up from his crouch and looked at her. "You built this yourself." "With Della." And Otho Greaves gave me corrections. He looked around the room at the thermometer bracket, at the ledger open on the table, at the drawing spread beside it. He said nothing else. He put on his hat and walked back out into the 22 below without asking any other questions. But he had come. He had put his hand on the stone and felt what it held. That was a kind of answer, though, to what question exactly Imogen wasn't yet sure. It was Della who found out. She came home from school on a Friday in mid-December with her scarf wound twice around her face and an expression underneath it of someone carrying something they wished they didn't have to carry. She set her books on the bench and stood there a moment, not unwinding the scarf, and Imogen recognized the posture. It was the one Della made before saying something hard. "I heard something at Grant's," Della said. "When I stopped for the thread you needed." Imogen waited. "About Mr. Graves." Della finally unwound the scarf. His son, Eli. He was 19 when he died. It was the winter of 1882. Imogen was still. "He went out in a storm," Della said. "To help a family that had just come to the settlement. They were new, and their chimney had failed in the cold, and they were going to freeze. He went to help them, and the storm turned and he couldn't find his way back." Della looked at the bench. "Mrs. Grant said Mr. Graves blamed the new family. Said if they had built a proper chimney like everyone else, Eli wouldn't have needed to go." Outside, the wind picked up for a moment and then settled. "He doesn't hate you because you're doing something different," Della said. "He hates you because Eli went out to help someone doing something different and didn't come home." Imogen sat down on the bench. She pressed her palms flat against the stone on either side of her, the warmth pressing back steady and even. Della sat beside her. Neither of them spoke for a while. After a long time, Imogen said, "He still came and put his hand on the stone." Della leaned her shoulder against her mother's arm. "Maybe that means something," she said. Maybe it did. January came in on a Wednesday with a sky that looked wrong, a particular shade of gray-white flat, and very high, the kind of sky that experienced Dakota settlers recognized as the ceiling of something large gathering its full weight. The temperature had been falling since New Year's, a long, steady decline without the usual brief moderations. By the 6th of January, it was 30 below at midday. By the 9th, the thermometer Otho had given her read 37 below at sunrise and was still dropping. Imogen increased her firing schedule. Every second morning instead of every third, the same fast, clean burn, but held slightly longer, the stone fed more aggressively. She sent Della to Hattie's to borrow 2 extra wool blankets, which meant she was not certain the bench would be enough alone, which she didn't say aloud. On the 10th, 3 things happened. Thomas Grant appeared at her door in the morning with a 50-pound sack of cornmeal, which he set down without explanation and left without entering the cabin. Imogen stood in the doorway watching him go, and could not determine whether this was settlement of account apology or something else entirely. She brought the sack inside and added a mark in the ledger. That afternoon, Wendell developed a cough. Dry at first, then wet by evening, the kind that settled in the chest and stayed. She made the willow tea and warmed a stone to wrap and put at his feet, and she felt his forehead with her lips, the way her mother had done, and found it warm, but not yet alarming. And at dusk, the sky she had been watching for 4 days finally opened. The wind arrived before the snow, a wall of sound from the northwest that struck the cabin and made the timbers flex in a way she had felt before but never gotten comfortable with. Then the snow came horizontal, driving against the west-facing window hard enough to make the glass shudder in its frame. Within an hour, Imogen could not see the woodpile from the door. Within 2, the sound outside was not wind anymore, but a sustained low roar, a single undifferentiated note that pressed against the cabin from every direction at once. She built the fire. Not the usual fire, not the measured 40-minute controlled burn of her regular schedule. She loaded the firebox full with the best fuel she had, dry split pine, the densest and longest burning of what remained, and she opened the draft all the way and stepped back. The fire took with a sound she could feel in her sternum, the temperature climbing in the firebox faster than she had ever run it before the cast iron door, going from warm to untouchable in under 5 minutes. Della appeared in the doorway of the bedroom with Wendell wrapped in the extra blanket, both of them watching. "It's all right," Imogen said. Wendell coughed. His eyes were bright with fever. How long? Della asked. Long enough. The firebox ran for 70 minutes. She could tell from the deep orange light at the edges of the draft door that the interior temperature was higher than she had ever attempted, well past 1500 degrees, approaching something her mother's notes had marked in the margin as the upper limit before the fireclay joints began to soften. She watched the corners of the firebox for the hairline cracks that would mean she had gone too far. She did not see them. After 70 minutes, she closed the draft door completely. The silence inside the firebox was absolute. The stone bench began to radiate within the half hour, not the gentle warmth of the usual system, but a deep pressing heat, the kind she could feel through her skirt when she stood close. She pressed her palm to the surface and had to pull back after 3 seconds. Good, she said to herself. Good. Outside, the bow continued to build. The roar against the cabin walls was constant now, the sound of a world that had decided it was done with the possibility of warmth. Inside, the stone was hot. Wendell fell asleep against Della on the bench, his breathing still rough but slowing toward something more ordinary. Imogen sat on the floor with her back to the warm stone and listened to the storm and began to calculate for the first time how many days the system would need to carry them. 4 days, she thought. Maybe 5. The bench had never been tested past 36 hours. She did not know if 4,000 pounds of stone could hold enough against 40 below for 4 days, not with Wendell sick and Della needing to stay warm, and the fuel supply limited to what was stacked in the lean-to, which she had not been able to check before the storm closed the door. Then underneath the roar of the wind, she heard something else. A horse. The particular high sound a horse makes when it is terrified, not of a predator but of cold, a short, desperate cry, nothing like the easy sound of an animal at rest. It came from the east, from the direction of the Holloway property, and then it came again closer. Imogen stood up from the floor. She went to the window, the west-facing one where the snow drove hardest, and put her face close to the glass and could see nothing beyond the white. She went to the door and cracked it 2 inches, and the wind hit her face like an open hand, and through the gap she could hear the horse very close now, close enough to be in her yard, and beneath it something lower, a voice that was trying to form words and not quite managing. She looked back at the bench, at Della awake now watching her, at Wendell asleep. She took her coat from the hook. Della's voice came sharp and quiet. "Mama, I'll be right back," Imogen said. She pulled the door open against the wind, which required both hands and most of her weight, and stepped into the storm. The cold was not cold. That was the wrong word for what hit her. It was subtraction. It subtracted the air from her lungs in a single instant and replaced it with something that made breathing feel like an act of will rather than reflex. She pulled her collar up over her mouth and bent into the wind and took 3 steps into the yard. The horse was at the fence. It was Bram Holloway's gray mare. She recognized the blaze on the face, even through the driving snow, and on its back barely was Bram himself. He was leaning forward over the horse's neck with his arms wrapped around it, his coat ice-encrusted, his face pressed against the mane in a way that was not riding but holding on. She grabbed the bridle and pulled, and the horse came willingly, glad for direction. Bram lifted his head. His face, when she saw it, was wrong, the color of the sky, gray-white, the lips dark. He was conscious. He was conscious and trying to say something. "Adeline," he managed. "The baby." Imogen held the bridle and the storm pressed against them both. His wife. The child born in September. Their farm was 2 miles south across open ground, 2 miles of this wind. She looked back at the cabin door, which she had left open, which was letting the cold in, which was letting the warmth out, which was the thing she could not let happen with Wendell feverish and 4 days of storm ahead. She looked at Bram. She made herself calculate. She could not leave. She had 2 children inside and one of them sick, and if she went south into this storm, she might not come back. And if she did not come back, there was no one. There was no one else for Della and Wendell. She could not go. She stood in the storm with the horse's bridle in her hand and understood in the plainest possible terms what it meant that she could not go and what it would mean for Adeline Holloway and her September child if she did not. She pulled the horse to the door and helped Bram down. He came off the saddle in stages, his legs not working properly, and she caught most of his weight with her shoulder against his ribs. She got him through the door. She got the door shut. She stood inside with the warmth pressing back against her face and the cold coming off Bram's coat in visible waves, and she looked at Della. Della was already on her feet. "I need you to run to Mr. Graves," Imogen said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. 400 yards east. You know his door?" Della looked at the storm door. She looked back at her mother. Imogen crossed the room in 4 steps and took Della's face in both her hands. "Listen carefully," she said. "Tell him where Adeline is. Tell him I cannot leave Wendell. Tell him she stopped. Tell him exactly this. I cannot go because I have children to protect, and he went out once before to help someone in a storm, and I am asking him to go again." Della's eyes were very still. "Tell him that," she said. "Tell him exactly that." Della looked at the bench where Wendell slept. She looked at Bram, who had sunk onto the floor against the wall and was shaking in long, deep waves, the color beginning to come back into his face in patches. She put on her coat. She put on her scarf. She looked at her mother once more. Imogen took her by the shoulders and said, "You go straight east and you do not stop." Then she opened the door, and Della went into the storm without looking back. Imogen shut the door and stood with her back against it and pressed both palms flat against the wood and listened to the storm. The bench radiated behind her. The stone held its warmth, the way stone does patiently, without drama, without asking to be thanked for it. The firebox was cold and dark, and the system was running on what it had already absorbed the 4,000 pounds of river rock, slowly surrendering the heat they had taken in degree by degree into the air of the cabin, where a sick child slept and a half-frozen man lay shaking on the floor, and a woman stood at a closed door and counted the seconds her daughter had been in the wind. Outside, the bow was just beginning its second day. Outside, the temperature was still falling, and Della Vale was somewhere in the white. The seconds Imogen counted were not even seconds. They were the spaces between the gusts, the brief instants when the roar outside dropped half a note and she could hear or imagine she could hear something beneath it. She stood at the door with her back pressed against the wood and her hands flat on the planks, and she counted those spaces the way you count the distance between lightning and thunder, trying to understand how far away the danger is. Bram Holloway had stopped shaking. That was either a good sign or the beginning of a bad one, and she crossed the room to him and pressed the back of her hand against his cheek and found it cold still, but returning the skin no longer the gray-white of a man whose blood had pulled inward to protect his core, but something closer to living color, the faint pink of circulation finding its way back to the surface. She pulled the spare blanket from the chest at the foot of the bed and put it over him, and he opened his eyes. "Adeline," he said again. "Someone's going—" Imogen told him. "Lie still." He closed his eyes. His breathing was slow and regular, and she let herself believe that was enough for now. Wendell slept on the bench. She checked him next his forehead, his breathing the sound his chest made when she put her ear close. The cough had not worsened. The fever was the same. The bench beneath him was still radiating strongly the deep stored heat of the long burn, holding steady against the cold that pressed through every seam of the cabin walls. She went to the window that faced east. She could not see 400 yards. She could not see 40. The storm had reduced the world to a pale, moving nothing, and she stood at the glass with her forehead against it and watched the nothing, and said in the lowest voice she could make the name of her daughter. Then she went to build a fire. Not the bench system. The bench was already running as hot as she could ask it. She built a small open fire in the repurposed iron stove she used for cooking, feeding it carefully with the scraps and the smaller pieces, keeping it modest because she needed the cabin's air supply for the 2 people breathing harder than normal, and she did not need competing drafts. The stove's exhaust went up the old capped flue at a different angle. A workaround Otho had helped her configure, and the heat it produced was immediate and direct, and different in character from the bench, sharper, less patient, the kind of warmth that announces itself rather than simply being present. She needed both kinds tonight. An hour passed. She did not sit down. She moved between the stove and the window, and Wendell and Bram a circuit. She walked without thinking, touching each point of the room in turn, the way you check on the things you are responsible for. The ledger lay open on the table, the temperature she had recorded at dusk, 38 below, a number that her mother's notes had marked in the margin as the threshold past which no conventional chimney design could reliably maintain a livable interior. The bench was well past that threshold. The room was 64 degrees. She recorded the new reading. She did not record that her daughter was outside in it. Then the door opened. Not knocked, opened hard the way you open a door when you do not have hands free. Della came through it in a burst of cold and snow mist, and behind her came Alaric Graves, and behind him came another shape that resolved into Hattie. And Imogen had 1 second of purely unreasoning relief before she understood that they had come from the east and not the south, which meant they had not yet gone for Adeline. She looked at Alaric. He was already looking at her. His face said that Della had delivered the message exactly as instructed. "Bram," he said. "Where?" She pointed. He crossed to Bram in 4 steps and crouched beside him and put a hand on his chest, checking the heartbeat the way a man checks it who has needed to check it before. He looked up at Imogen. "The baby was born in September," Imogen said. 7 weeks old. His jaw moved. He stood up. "I need 2 hours," he said. "Maybe 3. Hattie was already pulling off her outer layer, already moving toward Wendell, her hands unwrapping themselves from their gloves, with the brisk efficiency of someone who has arrived at an emergency and is sorting it by severity. "Go," Hattie said to Alaric. "I'm here." Alaric looked at Della, at the girl who had come 400 yards through that storm, with a message that contained the words he went out once before, and I am asking him to go again, and something crossed his face that was too complex to name and too brief to examine. He put his hat back on. He went back out into the storm. He took Bram's gray mare because she knew the way south, and he leaned into the wind the way a man leans who has learned that wind is not an obstacle but simply a fact of the landscape like grade or distance. Hattie had made him take the extra wool blanket folded and tucked inside his coat. He did not argue with her about it. Imogen watched the door close and stood in the warmth of the room and felt the particular weight of having asked someone to do something she could not do herself, which is one of the heavier things a person carries. She set it down somewhere she could pick it up again later. There was enough to carry right now. Hattie had Wendell awake and sitting up and was doing the mother examination ears throat the sound of the chest through the fabric of his shirt. She made a sound that Imogen had learned to read as not worrying but watching. "His lungs are clear," Hattie said. "It's high in the chest, not deep. Keep him warm and keep him still and he'll run himself into trouble come spring the same as always." Imogen sat on the bench beside her son and put her arm around him, and he leaned into her side with the complete trust of a 6-year-old who has decided that his mother is in charge of the world's temperature and that this is a reasonable arrangement. "Mama," he said, "is Della wet?" Della had hung her coat on the nail by the door and was sitting at the table, and she looked at Wendell when he said this, and her expression did what Della's expressions very rarely did. It went soft and a little undone at the edges. "I was wet," Della said. "I'm drying now." He accepted this. He leaned harder into Imogen's side and closed his eyes. The second hour was the hardest. Hattie made tea from what was in the kitchen, and they sat the 3 of them and Bram motionless on the floor and listened to the storm which had not lessened. Bram had come far enough back to ask questions, and Imogen answered them steadily. Alaric had gone. He had taken the mare. The mare would know the way. Bram's hands moved toward the door twice, and she watched him decide each time against it, the calculation visible on his face, a man understanding that he is not the most useful thing for his wife right now, that the most useful thing he can do is be warm enough to be of use when it counts. He stayed on the floor. He pressed his palms flat against the lower stones of the bench, which were cooler than the top surface but still holding, and he kept them there. Hattie said at some point that felt like the middle of the second hour but might have been the beginning of the third. "My husband said something when I told him what you were building. He said his master in Bratislava had a saying, 'The kiln that holds longest is the one that was packed slowest.' He said he thought about that for 20 years before he understood it wasn't about kilns." Imogen looked at the bench, at Wendell asleep against her, at the brick in the center of the cap, the 2 words pressed into clay. She thought about her mother packing that brick, the particular clay she had carried from Bohemia in a sealed crock too heavy to justify on practical grounds carried anyway. The choosing of it. "You could have built anything from American clay," Hattie said, looking at the brick. She brought the old ground because she needed the first thing made in the new place to be made from the old place. So she'd know the warmth was the same warmth Imogen said. Hattie looked at her. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what Otho said she would have meant." It was close to 3 in the morning when the sound came. Not a knock. None of them had hands free for knocking. A boot against the door 3 times, the unmistakable signal of someone loaded down on both sides. Imogen crossed the room in seconds and pulled the door open, and Alaric came through it with Adeline Holloway held against his chest and the baby inside Adeline's coat, both of them wrapped in the wool blanket and in something else, a second coat, Alaric's own coat, which he had gotten off his own back and onto them somewhere in the 2 miles of storm. He was in his shirt, in 38 below. He got through the door and Imogen pushed it shut against the wind, and he crossed to the bench and set Adeline down on it, not gently, because gentle was not the operative value here, but correctly, her back against the warm stone, the baby still tucked inside the coat against her chest. Adeline's eyes were open. She was conscious. Her lips were the color of a winter sky, but she was looking at Alaric with an expression that meant she knew where she was. Hattie moved her aside with the efficiency of someone who has been waiting for exactly this and needed the space. The baby made a sound, not a cry, something smaller, something that required more effort from the lungs than it produced in volume, but a sound that was unambiguous in its meaning. Alive, present, working at it. Bram made a noise from the floor that was not a word, and he was on his feet somehow reaching for his wife's hand, and Imogen stepped back to give him the room, and she looked at the bench, at the stone that was still warm, that had been warm for 18 hours. Now that was doing the thing her mother had understood it could do, and she looked at Alaric Graves standing at the edge of the room in his shirt in January in the Dakota Territory, getting cold again in the warmth he had delivered other people to. She took Caleb's heavy coat from the back of the door. It was the one she had kept for Wendell to grow into the one that smelled less like Caleb every month. She crossed the room and held it out to Alaric. He looked at it. He put it on. It was a little short in the arms. Caleb had not been as broad through the shoulders, but he pulled it closed and stood in it, and the shaking that had been starting in his hands subsided. Hattie was working on Adeline, checking temperature, checking the baby. The baby made the small sound again. Bram was talking to his wife in a low, continuous voice that had no particular words in it, just the sound of a man reminding someone that he is there. Alaric stood at the far end of the bench. He was not part of that. He had delivered himself to the edge of the room and was staying there, which was its own kind of sense. Imogen brought him a cup of the tea that was left still warm, and he held it in both hands. After a while, she sat beside him on the bench. "Eli," she said, not as a question. As a name she was giving back to him since Della had brought it to her. He looked at the cup. "He went to help a family," Alaric said. "They had come from Illinois. Young couple, they'd never seen a real Dakota winter. Their flue had blocked with ice common enough if you don't know to leave the cap a certain way." He stopped. The storm came up fast. He knew the way. He'd made that walk in the dark 100 times. He stopped again. The particular silence in the room was the kind that forms when everyone present has chosen to hold very still. "It was the cold, not the helping, that took him," Imogen said. Alaric's hands tightened on the cup. "I know that," he said. "I've known it since the spring after." He exhaled slowly. "I just needed to be angry at something, and the new family was easier than the cold." Della had come to stand in the doorway of the bedroom, listening in the way she listened, fully and without interruption, giving it her whole face. Alaric looked at her. At this girl who had come 400 yards through the worst storm in 10 years to knock on his door with a message that cracked him open, the way a cold crack runs through stone, not breaking it, just revealing what was already there. "Your daughter," he said to Imogen. "Yes," she said. He looked back at the bench, at the warm stone, at the brick at the center with its 2 pressed words. "She said I went out once before," he said. "She said she was asking me to go again." "Yes." He was quiet. Then, that was the right thing to say. "I know," Imogen said. "She's 11 and she already knows which words open which doors." Alaric set the cup down on the bench surface, and he looked at where it sat on the warm stone beside the clay brick in a cabin that was 68 degrees while the world outside was 38 below and still descending. And something moved across his face that was a long time arriving and looked, when it got there, like the thing that replaces grief after grief has finally finished being the only tenant. He put his hand on the stone, not the testing hand of the first visit pressing to verify, just his hand flat and open, the way you put your hand on the shoulder of someone you have decided to stop being angry at. He said, "My wife wanted to come. I told her the roads were impossible." Imogen said, She can come in the morning." He nodded. He kept his hand on the stone. Adeline Holloway's color was returning in the way color returns after cold. Slowly, unevenly, the cheeks first, then the throat, then the hands. By 4 in the morning, she had nursed the baby, which Hattie said was the only test that mattered, and the baby had taken it with the focused determination of someone making a point. Bram had not moved from beside her, which was not surprising, and had fallen asleep sitting upright against the bench with his wife's hand still in his, which was... Hattie dozed in the chair. Della had gone back to bed and lay with Wendell, one arm around him, both of them finally still. Imogen sat alone on the bench in the hours before dawn, in the quiet of a cabin that held 7 sleeping people and the warmth of a fire that had been out for 12 hours. The stove was cold now, too. Only the bench was left, the stone bench, the river rock and dense clay and fire clay joints, and the careful work of 6 weeks, radiating steadily into the room the way it had been designed to do, the way her mother had known it would do, the way her father's apprentice had learned to do from her mother's drawings in a city on the other side of an ocean 40 years ago. She was not cold. She picked up the ledger and recorded the temperature, 61 degrees, falling slowly, still livable. Outdoor temperature she could not check without opening the door. She left that row blank. She sat with the ledger open on her knee and looked at Alaric Graves asleep in the chair he had taken when Hattie moved to the bed, his big hands slack on the armrests, Caleb's coat still on him. She looked at Bram and Adeline against the bench. She looked at the baby's face, which was visible above the fold of Adeline's coat, small and complete and utterly indifferent to the historic cold it had arrived in. She thought every person in this room was held by the same stone tonight. Then through the pre-dawn quiet she heard Bram say her name, low so as not to wake anyone else. She looked at him. He was awake, his wife asleep against his shoulder, watching Imogen with an expression she couldn't quite read in the dark. He said, "I have something for you. When the storm clears." Something I should have understood years ago but didn't have the right words. She looked at him. He said, "My father was a blacksmith. Bohemian. He died before I was old enough to learn from him properly. He left a box. Tools, mostly. And a paper. I always thought it was something technical. I couldn't read the writing. It was old German, the kind my father's people used." Imogen waited. "I showed it to a school teacher once," Bram said. "She said it was a heating design, a bench, stone and clay, and something about channels." He paused. "I thought she had it wrong. I put it back in the box." The fire had been out in Imogen's chest for a long time. Something very small was lit there now, just beginning. "Your father was Bohemian," she said. Bram nodded. "The same hills possibly," she said. "The same knowledge. Different families, different ports, different decades, same understanding of how stone holds heat." He looked at the bench, at Adeline and the baby warm on the stone, his wife's body warmed by the stone that had absorbed the fire, absorbed it and kept it, and was still keeping it now in the dark. "It kept us alive tonight," he said. "It was built a long time ago," Imogen said. "We just built it again." When the storm broke on the 4th day, it broke quickly, the way Dakota storms sometimes do, the roar dropping to silence between 1 hour and the next, the light changing from that flat compressed gray to something with depth in it, actual distance, the quality of light that means the sky has remembered that it contains space. Imogen opened the door and stood in the cold morning, which was still cold, 15 below according to the thermometer, but still in a way the previous 4 days had not been. The snow was chest high against the north wall of the cabin. The yard was smooth and blank, every familiar shape buried. The woodpile was gone into a white mound. The fence posts were heads above water, but the cabin was standing, and warm. Bram and Adeline had left before dawn, the 3 of them wrapped and horsed, and the storm already thinning enough to see 20 yards. Bram had stopped at the door and looked at Imogen with the expression of a man who understands that a debt exists and does not yet know the proper denomination for settling it. She had told him to get his family home, and he had gone. Alaric Graves had left an hour later, returning Caleb's coat to the nail by the door before he went. He had stood at the door for a moment and looked at the bench, at the brick in the center of the cap, at the thermometer bracket beside the door, at the ledger on the table, and he had said very quietly, "I built 33 chimneys in this territory. Every one of them is heating the sky." Imogen had said, Come back in the spring. I'll show you the dimensions." He had looked at her for a moment. "I'll bring Eli's tools," he said. He had good ones. Then he went out into the clearing storm and she watched him go, and she closed the door. That morning, she and Della and Wendell ate the last of the cornmeal as mush with the apple butter Mabel Foss had left on the doorstep 6 weeks ago. Wendell's cough was already loosening, moving higher and less consequential, the kind of cough that would be gone in 3 days and leave no trace. He ate 2 bowls. Afterward, Della helped her clear the bench surface, the cups, the ledger, the spare blankets. They worked without speaking, which was one of the things Imogen loved best about her daughter, the understanding that not everything needed words. When the surface was clear, Della ran her hand down the length of the stone from one end to the other, the way you run your hand along something you're learning the shape of. "It's still warm," Della said. 4 days, Imogen said. "The storm burned us for 4 days, and the stone held it." Della stopped at the center, at the brick. She looked at the pressed letters, Dirge Teplo, and she looked at her mother, and she put both hands flat on the stone on either side of the brick, the way someone lays hands on something they are claiming as their own. "Bongwai never got to see this," she said. "The bench. What it actually does." She knew, Imogen said. She sent the drawings ahead. Della looked at the stone under her hands. "I want to learn all of it," she said. "The dimensions, the clay ratios, the corner angles, everything Otho told you, though." Imogen looked at her daughter, her 11-year-old daughter who had walked 400 yards into a killing storm with a message she had delivered without alteration, who had come home and asked no particular credit for it, who was standing now with her hands on warm stone in January in the Dakota territory saying, "I want to learn all of it." "Then we'll write it down," Imogen said. "Together, properly." They began that afternoon. Imogen read from her mother's drawings and her own ledger entries and the corrections Otho had given her, and Della wrote it all down in the clean, careful hand she'd inherited from no one in particular and had apparently developed on her own, the way some skills arrive. They worked at the table while the sun moved across the snow outside, which was the first sun in 4 days, and Wendell sat on the bench and rebuilt a tower of wooden blocks he'd been working on since November, which fell down and was rebuilt, fell down and was rebuilt, patient in the way that only 6-year-olds can be patient. The new drawings, when they were done, looked nothing like her mother's. They were rougher and more annotated with Della's practical questions written into the margins. Why this angle and not steeper? What if the stone is sandstone, not river rock? How do you know when the clay is wet enough? And Imogen answered each one in her own handwriting. The answers fitted around the questions, the way you answer the things people actually ask rather than the things you expected them to ask. At the bottom of the last page, Della drew a small cross-section of the firebox, meticulous and exact, and beneath it she wrote in her careful hand, "Hold the warmth, Dirge Teplo," for whoever needs it next. Not a signature, a direction. Weeks later, when Bram Holloway came through the clearing snow with his father's box under his arm, Imogen spread his father's old paper beside her mother's drawings on the table. The 2 documents were not identical, different hands, different dialects, different decades, but the firebox proportions were nearly the same, and the horizontal channel was there in both. And the note about stone density was there in both in different words that meant the same thing. 2 people from the same mountains on the same ocean in the same new country who had never met, whose children had never met, who had come to rest 2 miles apart on the Dakota plains and never known the other had the same knowledge folded inside them. The warmth had arrived before they had. It was already here waiting. Imogen made the last entry in the ledger the morning after Bram's visit. She wrote the outdoor temperature still cold, but rising the long, slow climb of February toward something livable. And she wrote the indoor temperature, which was 67 degrees, and she wrote the fuel used for that morning's fire, which was 1 bundle of dry willow and half an armload of split pine. And she wrote the hours the bench had held since the last fire, which was 21. Then she closed the ledger and set it beside the new drawings, Della's drawings, and she went to the window and looked at the yard, which was beginning to show the shapes of things again, the fence posts, the wood pile, the path to the creek. In the spring, she would teach anyone who wanted to know. In the spring, she would write to Otho's master's family in Bratislava if she could find an address and tell them that the drawings had arrived safely. After all that they had crossed an ocean in her mother's hands, and survived a winter that no vertical chimney in Blackwood had managed without breaking someone. and that they were now in the hands of a 12-year-old girl who had already annotated them with better questions than most grown men would think to ask. She put her palm flat against the stone bench one last time in the long season. Still warm. Outside, the first real light of the year was falling across the snow without disappearing into it, and the shadow of the cabin stretched long and clean across the white ground, and somewhere under 6 feet of snow, the creek was already moving, pushing toward March, carrying its stones along the bottom in the dark. River stones. Dense. Heavy grain. The kind that hold what they're given and give it back slowly when the room needs it without being asked. The kind her mother had known how to use and had sent the knowledge on ahead. The kind that hold the warmth. If someone in your life has left something behind, a skill, a phrase, a way of doing things that keeps you warm long after they're gone, share their name in the comments below. I read every one. And if this story moved you, please subscribe. These are the stories we're here to tell one at a time, for anyone who still believes that the things handed down to us are worth the carrying. Sleep well tonight. The stone is warm.